And the next question is a bit tangential to the whole question of the resurrection. It is the question is, ex, can you expatiate the phrase "God died on the cross"? The context here is in the Philippines. There are some apologists who deny that we can say, for them, you can say Jesus Christ
Yeah.
died on the cross, but you cannot say God died on the
All right.
cross. So it's been a bit of a never-ending issue in some Catholic circles here in the Philippines.
Well, yes. Well, I covered this in Christology. And actually, Ludwig Ott's book is one of the best in explaining this, what is called the communication of the idioms. Now, Jesus Christ, according to the Council of Chalcedon, is one person, but who must be acknowledged in two natures, human and divine. His divine nature was his from eternity, as the eternal word of God. His human nature is assumed from the Blessed Virgin Mary. But the two natures come together without confusion or change, without division or separation. So to Jesus, we could attribute all qualities, all the properties that are human, and all the properties that are divine. So we have to say, who do we mean when we say God suffered on the cross? Jesus, because he's God. If you're speaking about Jesus in the concrete and you call him God, then it is true that God suffered on the cross. But God, the God-man, in his human nature, it was rejected several times what is known as Theopasianism, the idea that the divine nature, which is impassible, incapable of suffering, died on the cross. But the God-man, Jesus, in the concrete, who is God, died on the cross. So it's perfectly legitimate if by God you mean Jesus, who is God, died on the cross. That's true, but he died in his human nature, not his divine nature. But this has some scriptural warrant to it. In the Acts of the Apostles, Peter said, if you knew, you would not have put to death the author of glory. Well, who's the author of glory? God. But it says in the Acts of the Apostles, he was put to death. So our friend, Father Ludwig Ott, discusses this and gives some very good examples of what is known as the communication of idioms, which is really it would mean that both the communication of both divine and human properties to Christ in the concrete. So I'll just read, he discusses this and gives some very good rules. It gets a little bit complex, but he says, as long as it's in the concrete, not in the abstract. So for example, the Son of Man died on the cross. Jesus created the world. These are accurate. But the rule is not valid if there be reduplication. By reduplication, the concrete term is limited to one nature. Thus, it is false to say Christ has suffered as God, or Christ created the world as a human being. It must also be observed that the essential parts of the human nature, body and soul, are referred to the nature whose parts they are. Thus, it is false to say Christ's soul is omniscient, Christ's body is everywhere or ubiquitous. But he gives some very good scriptural examples of this as well. But that's the one that I remember. Acts 3:15, the author of life you have killed. Or Acts 20:28, to rule the church of God, which he, God, has purchased with his own blood. Does God have blood? Not the eternal, not the Holy Trinity, not the eternal word, but the word made flesh, assumed body and soul with blood, and he poured out that blood on Calvary. Well, maybe that's enough for that answer. That's the best I could do.
So we can say directly, God died on the cross.
Yes, that's accurate. If by God you're referring to the concrete person of the God-man, Jesus. Now, Nestorius, in the ancient church, he was a a patriarch, an archbishop of Constantinople, he had trouble with this. And he says, well, God can't suffer. So he said, Mary gave birth to Christ, and then God, the Word, united himself to Mary's child, maybe in the womb, but he filled the human Christ with, he inhabited him. So he filled him like a spirit in a temple. So Jesus was a God-filled man. But then did God really offer the sacrifice? No, Jesus, the man, offered the sacrifice, but he was a God-filled man. So this was condemned at the Council of Ephesus in 431, and Mary was called to be acknowledged as the mother of God, Theotokos. To the God, it means conceived in her womb was God from God, light from light, true God from true God. That's central to our faith.
Yes. So when we say God died on the cross, you can say that that is literal. That's not just symbolic or metaphorical. That's literal.
Right, because what is death? It's the separation of the soul from the body. So when Jesus died on the cross and went to the tomb, his soul, which was part of his human nature, united to his divine person, descended to the lower world, or to the realm of the dead, hell. But in other languages, it's put into the plural, more closer to the Latin, to the infernal places, the lower regions. But we don't speak that way in English. But they do in French, aux enfers, or Italian, alle inferi, or in Spanish, a los infiernos. He went to the lower regions, and then the hell of the damned they put in the singular, l'enfer, inferno, infierno. So he went to the lower regions to preach to the souls of who were dead, but St. Thomas Aquinas says he was still a man, but he was a dead man during the time between his death on the cross and his resurrection. But his body in the tomb, the general sense is that was still united to his divine person.
Mhm.
But
Yes.
but he was a man, but he was a dead man, because death is separation of the soul from the body. But his soul was still, which was human, was united to his divine person, hypostatically.
Mhm. So, okay. So, Robert, I hope you don't mind, but the reason I'm trying to make this as black and white as possible is because this has actually been a running controversy in Catholic circles here in the Philippines, especially in the southern Philippines. So I'm just trying to make it
Yeah.
clear, because I don't want people, because by the way, your talk is being streamed right now on our Facebook page, Defensores Fidei
That's
Foundation.
fine.
Yes, and we don't want them using your words and they say, you see, he didn't really say that God died. We don't want to. We don't want people to assume. That's why I'm trying to make what you're saying as clear as possible. So, God died on the cross.
That's accurate.
Yes,
Mhm.
it is
But by
God
God,
died.
we mean Jesus, the God-man.
Yes,
But the two natures come together without confusion or change, but without division or separation.
Mhm.
So the
And
two natures they have no subsistence in themselves. They subsist in his divine person.
yes. So when we say God died on the cross, that is literal.
That's a
And
literal truth.
yes, and
But the divine nature did not die on the cross.
yes, it's not the divine nature, but because Christ is God, therefore we can say literally that Christ, or rather, we can say literally that God died on the cross.
Yes.
And
It's scriptural. You have put to death the author of glory.
And it is wrong to deny that Christ died, or it is wrong to deny that God died on the cross.
That's right. If by that you mean the divine nature did not die on the cross, but the divine nature was his from eternity. But the divine person assumed a human nature, and so he died as the God-man,
Mhm.
and he was truly God. So if you want to say that he died only in his human nature, well, that's all right, because but his human nature was his hypostatically. It wasn't separate from him. So it was because he had a human nature. But Pope Leo the Great put this so well. He said, one nature shines forth in miracles, the other succumbs to injuries. So by becoming incarnate, the impassible God, the God incapable of suffering, was capable of death.
Okay.
That's there in the great letter of Leo the Great to Bishop Flavian, or Patriarch Flavian, 449.
Okay, so just to underline before we move on to other things. Okay, so God died on the cross, and this is a literal truth.
It's
And
a truth.
yes, and we cannot deny that it is a literal truth.
Exactly. If you're denying the divinity, to say, because Jesus was not, he didn't cease to be God on the cross.
Mhm.
So the one who died was one person, right? And so this is Leo the Great. I'll just read it to you. The Lord of the universe, concealing the immensity of his majesty, assumed the form of a slave. The impassible God did not disdain to be man subject to suffering, nor the immortal one to be subject to the laws of death. Well, there it is. The immortal one is subject to the laws of death. And Jesus offered himself on the cross. He suffered, died, and was buried. Now, on the third day, he rose from the dead. But he is one person. Otherwise, you're separating his divinity from his humanity into two persons, and that's Nestorianism. And that's a heresy. So it's an implied heresy to deny that God died on the cross.
Okay, I think that is clear enough. Okay, I'll be addressing the participants. Okay, I think that's clear enough. What Robert said is clear enough. And if people still find ways to twist what he said to mean that in fact God did not die on the cross, and I think that is already willful ignorance and willful distortion of the truth. So I just want to make that clear to our participants, because many of them are from apologetic circles, and this has been roiling our Catholic apologists for some time. Okay, it's nearly 11.